As a chief operating officer, we are, in my role, I'm constantly having to decide things like, resource and capacity, like, how many project managers are needed to implement the software in this hospital? What are the potential risks? How do we come up with mitigation plans on those risks? Most of the things that I deal with on a day-to-day have not been figured out. They are completely new scenarios that we then need to make a certain level of assumptions in order to then proceed.
Are you moving into health tech? The question on everyone's lips are what skills do you need for that move to be a success? And also, do you really need to finish your training to really be of huge value to an employer in the health tech community? So we answer these questions and more in this episode on how you can address the skills gap between being a clinician and a clinician in health tech and industry, whether that's clinical or non-clinical. And before we get started, as always, be an amazing part of our community. We really want you there because we are growing. If you go to medicfootprints.org/join our community. Anyway, on to this episode, which is with one of my dear friends, Jing. I'll tell you more about what he does just now.
So let's get real. Our value as doctors has significantly diminished over the last decade. So how can we turn that around by upskilling and creating rewarding and impactful careers on our own terms? Welcome to Disrupting Doctors' Careers. I'm your host, Dr. Abeyna Bubbers-Jones, and I'm on a mission to connect 1 million talented doctors with the best in diverse career opportunities.
Welcome to Disrupting Doctors' Careers. The episode, we're going back to health tech again. We love health tech. And we are talking specifically about the skills gap or the knowledge gap between being a clinician and being a clinician in the health tech world. And to address that question, I have invited one of my good friends, Dr. Jing Ouyang, who is an incredible entrepreneur in his own right. He's one of the NHS clinical entrepreneurs. That's how I know him. But also he is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Patchwork Health. So Patchwork Health is a workforce management solutions health tech platform for healthcare. So he's definitely keeping himself extremely busy on the rota side, obviously, but also managing to get clinicians in and around healthcare systems. So welcome, Jing. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was quite the lead-in. Lovely to be here.
I try. Brilliant. Well, let's get started because I am really passionate about this particular topic, like the whole podcast episode. And when we talk about skills gaps, it's always the tip on everyone's minds, especially as doctors, because when we move anywhere, like we do in medicine, we are used to saying, right, if I'm going to change specialty, for example, I'll need to go and do a course or start doing their exams and start studying and do a qualification of some description. When moving to industry, whether you're doing it as a clinician or in a non-clinical capacity, there is a very significant gap that isn't always filled by doing more qualifications. So I'd love to hear more about what you think along those lines. So firstly, why is there a skills gap between working as a clinician and working as a clinician or non-clinician in industry, particularly when we're talking about health tech? Should it really be that different? And why is it that different?
Yeah. I think it starts with our experiences in medical school. Medical schools are, structured in a manner, they deliver curriculums to prepare us the best that they can for clinical practice. And I think, we could easily get into a debate about whether or not they even prepare us well for, a clinical setting. But essentially, medical schools are there to, teach us, the basics of the science, the diseases, how to treat patients. They aren't, I think many of them haven't adapted to modern times and are necessarily thinking about the alternative careers that clinicians can take. as I mentioned, they're structured to essentially get you from medical school into becoming a successful, safe, and competent junior doctor. So I think it starts from, very traditional methods of education, and the curriculums are very much geared to clinical practice and clinical practice alone.
I'm going to jump in there and disagree with you wholeheartedly.
Oh, yeah? Please do. Please do.
No, I mean, because I always reflect on my medical education. And obviously the first 3 years you're doing a medical sciences degree, essentially. I mean, I went to Nottingham, so I did a BMed Sci. And then you've got the clinical years after that. I reflect, and I would say most of my clinical knowledge and applied clinical knowledge was really solidified and gained as a clinician. So from F1 onwards, and I'm using an example of when I, like, literally in the first few weeks of med school, year 1, we were offered anatomy, where you actually had a full cadaver in those times, an actual full cadaver, right? And I remember, like, it was such a great experience, an opportunity to learn the body, the anatomy. But again, like, I can learn by rote, you can get, do for exams. But I look back and actually I didn't really understand anatomy until I actually started studying for my surgical exams, which was like a number of years later. So I would say generally, medicine is like it's a vocational experience. Like, most of it is learned on the job. Yeah, I mean, that's why I disagree with you on that point. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, so you're correct there. It is very vocational, but that very much prepares you for clinical practice. Medical schools are laser focused at getting you to become a safe and competent clinician. But in terms of then, for many doctors or clinicians that want to then explore alternative careers, I would say that their experiences from university in places like medical school did not equip them with that wider experience needed to make that transition. And I think many of the clinicians that do make that leap realize that they have to adapt and find those educational experiences in their own ways, either at medical school or when they become doctors exploring wider opportunities. If you look at, so as an alternative, if you look at, say, business school, the business schools deliver a curriculum of didactic information. There's a curriculum to learn, but then they also supplement that with real world experience. So many will facilitate internships. They'll bring in speakers from industry. They will expose their students as much as possible to those avenues that a business school student can take once they graduate. I think it's safe to say that, from both of our kind of medical school experiences, we didn't really meet any kind of digital health entrepreneurs or any kind of clinicians that worked in pharma. It was very much about learning the diseases and the clinical practice.
I think absolutely, and actually makes me reflect on, even so now I'm an occupational health physician, right? Not many people in medicine know that's a specialty. I didn't know it was a specialty until I went looking for it, right? And we ran a conference a few years ago, which listed the number of specialties that most doctors have never heard of. And that, obviously these specialties are small, they're unique in their own right, etc., etc. They don't form the foundation of medical practice, so to speak. But what I'm trying to say is I appreciate, obviously, there is a foundation of knowledge that we need to gain. But at the same time, as you said, the real world experience beyond the clinical, it's not a priority in medical education. But if we're looking forward in the future to what healthcare will look like even in a few years' time, what should be changed in the approach to, a medical curriculum? How, especially in relation to the burgeoning opportunities in health technology, and actually what the future of being a doctor looks like. What was it? I saw an email this morning. I'm not sure if you saw it. I think this was on Forbes, right? Some company had raised millions, as they all do, several hundred millions. It's a US company, obviously, to create a doctor in a box. So it's an AI doctor in a box. You're smiling at me. Whereby someone could go and see a doctor for like, a nominal amount, right? Just walk in and have a chat with an AI doctor. So I'm using that as an example because, we know that AI, automation, all of those things they're incredibly present in our world. They're like, it would be silly not to adopt these things. But the question is, what is the role of doctors now and in the future, considering these technologies? How should we be repositioning ourselves and repositioning our value? I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but you can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah. So I suppose the first part of your question was around, how medical schools adapt, how the education system can change. I think we're seeing a lot of examples of that already. There are a number of medical schools opening that have to sell themselves a bit differently, and they're taking more innovative approaches to their curriculums. I suppose an example of that is for example Dr. Shafi Ahmed, who runs Bart's X, where they cover many of the topics that you just described, like the AI, blockchain, the application of exponential technologies, of frontier technologies in relation to healthcare. And at the very least, that for many medical students going through Bart's medical school, they get exposed to those kind of use cases and potentially inspired as well. If we think about a second example that I have is after graduation of medical school, you and I were both part of the clinician entrepreneur program that was founded by Professor Tony Young. And again, that is a large scale national educational program that looked to empower clinicians, give them the mandate, as it were, to pursue innovations in their own respective organizations, but also provided a curriculum that gave clinicians the skills around kind of like legal contracts, around fundraising, around technology building, that serve the purpose to essentially inspire and give some of the foundational knowledge needed to explore their own innovations, or to bring innovative thinking back to their organizations as well. So I think there are a lot of initiatives out there that are looking to kind of rewrite the curriculum and to supplement clinicians' education to meet with changes in the modern world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned the NHS Clin-Ent, because it does provide a hugely invaluable curriculum, particularly on the entrepreneurship side of things. And actually on that topic, do you feel, or do you have any thoughts on whether that is something in itself that is missing from the medical curriculum? Because as we know, most medical curriculums historically have been very academically research focused. So instead of relying on programs like this, which are focused mainly at actual practicing clinicians, should we be going back earlier and really nurturing them at student level?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, if you look at this in the context of the NHS workforce in general, especially with doctors, there is a huge brain drain at the moment. Many we enter medical school when we're 18 years old. We probably haven't thought through fully like what our careers would look like, but we're entering into a huge commitment, 5-6 years into a vocation. I think many will not have taken the pause to think, what do I actually want to do? Is this, and we all know that with medicine in particular, it's a bit of a conveyor belt. And it's very easy to graduate med school, do your F1, F2, and then, continue to be, climbing this ladder without that pause to think, well, what actually makes me fulfilled? What actually makes me, happy? And I think then, on that basis, I suppose, like opportunities are, there isn't always the headspace to think about the opportunities that are available. And I think so the introduction of these kind of programs like BartX or like, the Clinician Entrepreneur Program, they're not there to teach us everything there is to know about, working in industry or starting a business. They're there mainly to show us what the art of the possible is, what others have managed to do, and ultimately to inspire us. Because I think to some extent, and it comes down to, I think, some of the personality types and the way that we're trained as doctors. As doctors, we are, trained to be very process driven. We follow kind of, instructions and protocols to treat our patients. We're also told to be, very mindful of risks, given the liabilities of, treating patients. As a result of that kind of training, that kind of culture, it can be very difficult to then think, take the leap and think about wider opportunities. And I think it's the case for most kind of, whether it's, entrepreneurs or those that have made the leap into other industries, they may be reticent to do that because they are risk averse and they don't feel like they have the tools or know how to navigate into those organizations, which is also a great shame.
I think you've made some really valid points there, and particularly the last one on doctors naturally being risk averse, being used to following processes and guidelines. And a lot of that doesn't really exist, especially in the entrepreneurial world, which encompasses most of health technology, because there is a lot of uncertainty. And last night we had the first of the several commercial focused sessions on our Doctors in Industry Fellowship. And that was run because we usually have guest speakers for each session. And this one was with Michelle Griffin, who is she used to be an obs and gynae registrar. Now she's a women's health medical advisor. And she's had a really interesting journey since the beginning, since she left medicine, which took her through strategy consulting, cancer research UK directing. She was at TTP as a consultant. She did a whole load of other things. And it was really interesting with her take on, as doctors, especially working in health tech, especially working as an entrepreneur, you have to get used to the whole concept of uncertainty. When you talked about climbing that ladder, as you said, like not taking the pause from the age of 18, it's great because like our pathway is sorted for us, right? We don't need to even think about it. We just need to do the tick box and it's certain. Outside, and we totally live in a bubble because outside of that world, it absolutely does not work like that. You can put in a lot of energy and everything you have into a business and it can still fail, like that kind of thing. And it is really about being able to get comfortable with taking risks and also getting comfortable with that uncertainty, which you will never 100% be comfortable with. But so we talked about resilience in that context. And I know that that's actually taking us to what we're talking about, core skills, right? What core skills do doctors need to develop for an industry or health tech career? So we've talked about entrepreneurship, we've talked about resilience, we've talked about dealing with uncertainty, risk-taking. Is there anything else that you deem important in that?
Yeah, I suppose the starting point of that question is that, I suppose, tangentially or inadvertently, medical school and practice as a doctor gives us a lot of the skills needed to move into alternative careers. For example, medics are typically, type A personalities. They're very competitive. They're very hardworking. Many will explore opportunities in research just to progress in their clinical careers. And will develop academic or analytical skills. I think so already there's a lot of kind of like inherent skills from being a practicing doctor and an academic. And I think it's often the case that the imagination is sometimes lacking in terms of how you translate those skills into a life in industry. For example, I knew a couple of medical students that didn't graduate into becoming doctors. They went into banking or they went into consulting. And when you think about those kind of examples, it should raise the question of, well, why are they selecting from, careers well, I suppose from courses that have no relation to the work that they'll be doing. They certainly didn't do finance or management degrees. And it is just because, like, it's certainly the personality type, but also the fact that, as medical students, as doctors, we're used to, high pressure. We have a lot of exams. We have to assimilate a lot of information very quickly, need to make very sound judgments. So I guess my first point on this is that as clinicians, through our medical training, we already have all the skills that are highly desirable in industry, and that can't be discounted. In terms of what is then needed, well, as I mentioned, it's, firstly, it's a creativity to connect the dots, right? To take those skills and realize that they are transferable, and how you present that is really important in making that leap into whatever alternative career that you go into. I think we've covered the fact that I think clinicians, having been trained to be very risk averse and very process driven, need to get very comfortable with ambiguity, need to get very comfortable with a certain level of risk taking that they may not be familiar with. Those, I suppose, I think there's probably more.
I was going to jump in there just to ask about the risk takers. We talk about it quite a lot, but as a clinician yourself, as a doctor who's gone into health tech, can you give us an example, even on a day-to-day basis, let alone the fact you've started a business, on what risk-taking actually looks like in practice?
Ooh, a direct example. Well, I suppose, as a chief operating officer, we are, in my role, I'm constantly having to decide things like, resource and capacity, like, how many project managers are needed to implement the software in this hospital? What are the potential risks? How do we come up with mitigation plans on those risks? Most of the things that I deal with on a day-to-day have not been figured out. They are completely new scenarios that we then need to make a certain level of assumptions in order to then proceed. No amount of analysis, thinking, research will give me the definitive answer to those questions. And on top of that, the time pressure of making those decisions is very intense. You have to become very comfortable with making decisions in a world that is imperfect. You don't have all the data. You don't have the luxury of time to work through all the scenarios. So I think that would be my prime example of how, operating in a domain of uncertainty.
I found it really fascinating, just the way you described that. What was your specialty before you jumped ship?
Well, I left post foundation year 2, so I didn't actually have a true specialty. Although I was academic endocrine, I was on the academic endocrine foundation program.
Sure.
But to be honest, I don't think it is shaped by personality or my practices.
Because I was just thinking, like, again, I'm going back to my surgical background when I had to do trauma laparotomies, right? And obviously you go through the course and you have a structure, but at the end of the day, what's great about it is you have a structure so that you can deal with any uncertain scenario, because when you're literally opening up, you don't know what you're going to find. You have your process and procedure, but then you have to make quick, informed decisions to actually deal with the scenario. And that might be buy yourself some time by like packing and then leaving, right? But in you have more time here clearly with health tech. But I think it's really interesting what you talked about, the time pressure element. So when you talk about, again, in practice, the time pressure, what does that look like? Are we talking minutes? Are we talking hours? Are we talking weeks? Like, who's setting the deadline? Who's deciding that?
I think the deadline is a self-imposed deadline, right?
Okay.
Because when, in the context of myself as an entrepreneur, it's my own business. So, the faster the pace, the greater the agility, the more likely you are to succeed. And as we know with startups, the failure rate is very high. So you need to be adapting, changing, making decisions very quickly and hoping that you make, the most optimal decision at the time. So there's, those kind of deadlines. There might be external factors, like, for example, the board may have certain expectations. We as a management team may set certain targets or commitments, but by and large, they are self-imposed.
I think that's great, because I think about running Medic Footprints, and yes, I think I always want something done a lot sooner than it actually will get done. and that's always been the case, always. And actually, I think for me on a personal level, now we're looking at actually how do we slow things down. And that doesn't make sense when, as you said, you've got all these external pressures. And the other thing that we haven't talked about that doctors really need to get comfortable talking about is money, the M word. So again, as a co-founder, as a senior leader of your business, this may not be your particular job, but you've always got to be thinking ahead as to where is our revenue coming from? Are we hitting our targets? At the moment, I know, this funding is always on the forefront of every founder's mind, right? And so especially when we're talking about money, how as a doctor, as a clinician, where most of the time, driven by money, we're driven by social impact. How do you navigate around that with regards to how do you change your mindset so you can tackle that without getting too caught up in it? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suppose you can abstract that to some extent and talk about, the difference between being an employee and a director. I think the doctors, a lot of doctors complain. They complain about like the hierarchy. They complain about the absurdity of their jobs, and often they face numerous kind of pain points. But at the end of the day, it is still a job. There is, of course, the unique aspect to working as a clinician, which is, your responsibility to the patients. But say you work in A&E, by and large, if you are safe and you do your handovers correctly, then you can leave, the hospital and you can do something else. Like, there is a finish time in your role. Whereas when you certainly, in the case of entrepreneurship, you can, when you go into, when you start your own business, then the responsibilities are much greater. You often can't switch off in that same way. And that is where it also relates to the money as well. Because, when you're an employee in a hospital, you don't have to think about the budget of the department. You don't have to think about the financial viability of the hospital. When you become a director of a business, perhaps you have a bit more flexibility. You're not doing certain things like night shifts, but you absolutely are thinking about your runway. You're thinking about the money constantly. And you're thinking about how you grow your revenue, how you maintain your bottom line, all these things that have never fed into the considerations certainly in my case, when I was working as a doctor. So it's a much higher level of pressure and accountability.
Very well described. And, I'm just thinking, if I had to, knowing that I've been on both sides of the coin, so to speak, the employee and the employer or the director, I always reflect on, had I known at the beginning which would I have chosen, or would I go back to the other one because it was easier? And all the challenges that you've described, I've lived, especially being a director, switching off or not being able to switch off is one of the fundamental challenges that I face, and a lot of entrepreneurs face. Hence, burnout is very common in entrepreneurs as it is in doctors, right? Because there is no real end point. And yes, you can say I finish at 5 o'clock, but you don't really finish at 5. Your brain does not finish at 5 o'clock when you've got, employees that you've got to make sure you're getting enough revenue to pay them, but also you've got to make sure that you're hitting your targets. You want your company to grow. You've got your North Star. How are you going to get that? You've got to be creative. There's so many things that's going through your mind. But if you had to choose, I think about if I had to choose between the two, I would still go with like being a founder, being a director, and not having to, in some words, answer to anyone else outside of that, beyond the people that I am serving, which are doctors, right? That is what drives me. And I just love the flexibility element of it too much. And yes, the risk versus reward, I can't look back, and it's hard because I just think, could I go and work for someone else? And it's I do, because I'm still doing my occupational health work, and I do that. And I guess I still enjoy being able to switch off when I finish my clinic and then coming back. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, if you, looking back, which would you choose?
I mean, there are trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
And earlier in my career, I would have said, being an entrepreneur is the best thing ever. it certainly beats like, being on night shift in the hospitals, or, in the context of, everything going on with the junior doctor strikes, certainly is more financially rewarding. And as you've kind of described, the autonomy and the control is enormously valuable. So it ultimately comes down to the things that you prioritize. Having said that, though, like, as I've gotten older and reflected on things a bit more, it's not the lifestyle for everybody. Despite all the frustrations with, like, portfolios and working through a complex system with lots of hierarchy, there is an incredible amount of job security. You do progress by and large every year. And the work that you do as a clinician is rewarding in its own right. I do miss clinical practice. And unfortunately, with the way that things panned out with myself, I had to leave medicine to start Patchwork. I couldn't have really had that portfolio career where I was doing patchwork, for some part of my time, and then still practicing as a clinician. That wasn't available to me at the time, just because of where I was in my clinical career and the demands needed from my startup. I do sometimes think in an ideal world, I could have balanced the two, but it didn't work out that way. And this is also why I'm such a big advocate for the Clinician Entrepreneur Program, because a big part of that, of the ambition there, was to make the argument that clinicians could do both. They could, drive forward their innovation while still, being in clinical practice. And that was also, a big part of the retention strategy for the NHS workforce as well. But unfortunately, it didn't pan out for me in that manner. But to go back to your question, would I do things differently? Like, have I made, I suppose, the right choices on this? I do think I have, because, what I do today has, I believe, far more impact than as an individual doctor. But, it is tinged with a bit of regret, because I actually did really enjoy being a practicing doctor. But what I don't miss is, of course, the intense rotas and some of the politics and the bureaucracy tied to it all.
I think that's interesting, because I deal with the same question, a very common question we get from doctors, which is, if I want to change or develop my career beyond clinical, when should I do it in my career? Should I do it at the beginning? Should I do it at the end? Should I do a CCT? Blah, blah, blah. And usually I say it doesn't matter. And that still is generally my answer. But just looking at your career, I'm not giving career advice here, but like, for example, I made a decision to go into occupational medicine for many reasons, from surgery, that is, many reasons though, one of which, an important one that I know a lot of doctors are looking for, is the lifestyle aspect, right? And actually I changed to occupational medicine at the same time. It coincided with when I actually started Medic Footprints. It wasn't deliberate, that's just how it happened. And because of my choice of specialty, I was able to do both. And especially now, when I'm not training, because I finished my training a while ago, that I'm able to do both, and they feed into each other. So I guess the question is, had you been in a similar position, regardless of specialty, where you could have been, like, for example, we see a lot of GPs who become entrepreneurs, or, the GP pays for the entrepreneurship for a while. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I do wonder whether that could have been a possibility. Again, had you stayed a bit longer, not saying that was a necessity, but it's one of the things that I know a lot of doctors think about when they're thinking about moving industry or starting up or whatever. I say, generally speaking, it doesn't matter, but this is an important thing to also think about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. What I would say is, if you can, have a strategy in place. And I think, what you're talking about there is picking the right specialty to enable that, to enable you to explore different opportunities. I did, when I was a foundation doctor, I did 2 rotations of A&E. And I think, and A&E is brutal. in terms of the rota. You just don't have a lot of headspace or emotional bandwidth to consider wider opportunities. So then, if you extrapolate that, imagine if I was to do a career in A&E, then that would be the case for, at least a decade. And even as a consultant, you still have some on-call responsibilities. So, with respect to that, as you said, being a GP, doing 3 years and then qualifying is hugely appealing. But at the end of the day, you have to pursue, your passions and your interests. And for many people, listening to this podcast and for clinicians looking to kind of plan out their careers, they may not want to be a GP, or they may not want to, do a specialty that maybe has a better lifestyle, but may not be, academically fulfilling or clinically rewarding. And I think so it has to be taken, the decision has to be taken in that respect. The other point you made was around when best to leave, if indeed the answer is to leave. I think the starting point for me would be, is there a way of retaining your clinical practice while still exploring other opportunities? Hence the mention of the clinician entrepreneur program. But should you leave, you also need to then assess, what level of qualification you have. I left as, post foundation year 2. So I had no specialism. I could not claim to anybody that I was an expert in any kind of clinical field, other than maybe being a practicing, junior doctor and understanding what the pain point of that is. That was fine for the role and the business that I went into. Because my experiences as a junior doctor were very relevant to Patchwork, which enables flexible working, software. And also the role itself demanded a lot of my time, building a startup from ground zero. You could be devoting, 100-hour weeks to that and still not succeed. So, you're trying to eke out every marginal gain, every advantage to make your business a success. But had I chosen instead to go into pharma, for example, well, I know a lot of kind of colleagues who are principal investigators, for pharmaceutical companies, and they're very much relying on their expertise in research and on them being CCT qualified, right? Reaching the top of their respective fields. Same goes, with things like, consultancy. You go in at a different level into a consultancy based on your seniority as a clinician. And, having worked quite closely with many management consultancies in the context of Patchwork, I also know that, a bit more experience in the domain really does benefit on projects and benefits, you in pursuing those alternative careers as well. So I think there's no easy answer to this. There are a lot of considerations. And I think for anyone kind of deciding their career, you need to factor all these things in, know what the considerations are when when deciding what move you make.
I think that's really, really valuable advice, because there are a lot of moving parts in making that decision, and a lot of uncertainty that goes with it. As you said earlier, you can plan and strategize ahead, but you really don't know what the output is going to be unless you just go and do it, right? And so I would encourage, think about these, consider these moving parts. I know a lot of doctors have those financial considerations being at the forefront of the mind, particularly now. Really kind of think and work it through, but you're not going to really know until you actually do it, and then have mitigation plans within that. But I have to say, I have seen a lot of doctors who don't have a specialty, like yourself, Jing, who they fly. So I would say, whatever it is, you don't have to rely on your specialty to have a unique selling point. You have to look within yourself to determine what that is. Only you can determine what that is. And that doesn't have to be you being a doctor. That can be part of it, but doesn't have to be it. Because remember, there are lots of doctors out, doing the same thing these days, right? And so actually it's about differentiating yourself from others. And that's what you have to do in business all the time anyway. Anyways, but the last, before we close off, what, I guess we've kind of covered a bit of this question already, but what value do you see doctors having in the future landscape of healthcare and industry? And how can we best prepare for this as doctors? So what is the value that you see that we have in the future, and how do we prepare?
I suppose two things jump to mind. The first one is our knowledge in working within a healthcare system. And then secondly, the kind of the deep domain knowledge that comes from, pursuing a specialty. So when we think about, if we just explore that first point, which is around, understanding of the healthcare system, that is essentially how Patchwork Health came about. It was from myself and my co-founder Anas, working within NHS organizations as locum doctors, which inspired us to then start the business, because we were, whilst we were working in these organizations, we experienced numerous pain points when it came to booking into shifts, having the visibility of what was available, getting paid on time. It was actually that exposure which gave us the insight, which then seeded the idea for Patchwork. And I think in that context, I would challenge everyone who is working within the healthcare system to identify the improvements that can be made, and whether or not those kind of improvements can actually be translated into businesses. I think it's very easy for clinicians to get together and complain about their circumstances. But I would challenge people to, get a bit more creative. And, because if that's a pain point that you experience, it's something that others can experience. So how would you, exploit that? How would you capitalize on that to create something that actually improves the experience for the system and for your colleagues that are also experiencing similar kind of pain points? So I suppose that's one area of value, which is that actually the exposure in a healthcare system is valuable in its own right. Then secondly as well, the deep domain knowledge that you gain from going through a specialty is incredibly valuable. Many clinicians, if you pick a competitive specialty, let's say cardiology, many cardiologists will end up doing clinical research. They'll end up doing masters and PhDs. They will become a true expert in their field. And I think then knowing what your value is and what you can bring to the table, you can then apply that in a variety of different settings. We talked a bit about management consultancy. We talked about pharma. Many pharmaceutical companies want to be working with experts and primary investigators. That may be a bit more of a long game for people who, and may seem daunting for those earlier on in their careers. But a potential end game is to get to become a consultant and then use that expertise and leverage that in a variety of different organizations. We haven't even talked about things like artificial intelligence, for example, and some of the kind of the frontier technologies. When prior to Patchwork, I worked in Alderhay Children's Hospital. And they have they're a great organization. They have invested heavily in innovation. They have an innovation hub. And while I was there, they were working with IBM Watson to train to do some of the early work around generative AI and creating, clinically safe chatbots. In that work stream, they were working closely with senior clinicians to entrain the language models. So again, that's another application of that expertise. So so I think definitely, if you're willing to kind of play the long game, you can get to consultants and then use your expertise and apply it in a range of different industries and projects.
No, I think that's really, really helpful advice. And just before we finish, I'm going to play devil's advocate now, Jing. So you and Anas, your co-founder, you post-F2 locum experience, knowledge of the healthcare systems to an extent from a clinical experience and through the pain points that you experienced. Obviously, fast forward a few years, but you've managed to set up a company that is software focused. So I'd love to know where was your domain expertise there? You're working as a chief operating officer. Where was your domain expertise there? I'd love to hear more on this. Very briefly.
Yeah,
because clearly, you didn't have these things when you first started. You were both doctors. You knew what it was like as a clinician and those pain points, but you created a flourishing business as a result of that. But you haven't exactly got degrees in those areas we talk about. So I'd love to hear more
Yeah, very true, very true. I think, both Anas and I had that beginner's mindset. We had that naivety that thrust us into, that gave us the confidence, as it were, to pursue it. And you're absolutely right. We did not have any expertise when it came to building software, nor in being managers. I think looping back to what we originally talked about, which was some of the core skills, I think we had the personality type whereby we could apply those skills that we gained in medical school and connect the dots and then apply them into our subsequent roles within the startup. Unfortunately, we managed to scale and we managed to stay on top and learn. The other part of it, which we didn't really cover, we talked a lot about skills, but also experience is very important. So you're absolutely right that, I certainly, wasn't a chief operating officer from some Fortune 500 business that kind of landed in and brought in a load of playbooks. And, for Anas, this was his, we're both first-time founders. This was his first experience as being CEO as well. But I think what's really important is the experience that you can gain prior to starting your business. So in the context of myself, even in medical school, I was exploring all manner of different opportunities. I was doing research projects, getting involved in kind of student initiatives. Anas and I actually started a global health magazine while we were in medical school. And we actually saw some moderate success. I mean, no viable business model, but certainly we had some experience of working together and doing projects and, and launching them from 0 to 1. And I think these are the formative experiences that I would encourage, medical students and junior doctors to explore. So when I graduated medical school and I went to I trained as a doctor in the Northwest in Liverpool, where I'm originally from. I got really involved in the tech scene, in the health tech scene there. And I actually worked as an independent consultant for a number of organizations. So, for example, Liz Ashley-Payne of Orca, gave me a number of big breaks. And through my relationship with her, I got to work with Alder Hey, through Orca, through some other organizations as well. Speaking on behalf of Anas, he had a very interesting background anyway, in that he was a graduate medic at Imperial, and prior to that, he already had a career in medical illustration and in software design, having done an undergrad in something completely different. And when we started Patchwork, he was working as a Darcy Fellow in Chelsea and Westminster NHS Trust. And actually, the other half of the coin was that he got to intimately understand temporary staffing processes while he was a Darcy Fellow. So you're completely right that we didn't have much kind of formal job experience, but we had been hustling hard in the years preceding, and gaining experience and exposure in many different ways. I think, when we talk about the history of Patchwork, it's very easy to just consider it in the context of when we incorporated to where we are today. But if you look at our histories prior to that, we actually tried many different things before then hitting success with Patchwork. So we already had some credentials, some network, and some experience that ultimately convinced the first NHS trust to adopt us, and also our angel investors to back us.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, and particularly when it comes in my mind, I'm mean, hashtag hustle for skills. If you want to be successful, use that experience and leverage it so that people really buy into what you're doing and will continue to back you. So thank you so much, Jing. If anyone wants to get hold of you, what's the best way of doing that?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn, or I do have a Twitter as well.
Twitter, I've never heard of that platform, Jing.
Oh, sorry. X, formerly known as Twitter.
X. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, and let's hope to hear more of you in the future. Thanks so much, Jing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. All right.